I'm now joined by Shankar Singham, a former trade advisor to the UK Trade Secretary and the US Trade Representative. He's now chairman of Global Vision and Compete, which advocates global free trade. Also with us is Andrew MacDougall, the Director of Communications for the former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He worked on the CETA Canada-EU deal whilst Mr Harper was Prime Minister. So Andrew MacDougall, what lessons do you think there are from your negotiations from the CETA Canada-EU deal? How applicable do you think it is to the UK?
Well, I don't think that applicable, which is a shame. When you look at what Canada and the European Union tried to do, they came to it from a position of friendship, where Canada had already secured its economic trading relationship with the United States, its most important partner, and said, how can we add to that? And so we came to Europe and said, let's do a deal. And even then, as friends working together, it took 6 years to do the negotiations for the Canada-style free trade deal, another 3 to get that ratified and provisionally applied, and we're 3 years on from that. And only half of the European Union countries, including the Dutch just yesterday, have now passed that through their legislatures. So it's a long, tough, frustrating process that took 10 years for Canada, and we're looking at 10 months for the UK to divorce itself from the EU and rebuild a relationship.
But at the same position, though. That's the difference, isn't it?
But Canada started with all of the provinces on board, and all of the industry associations consulted and in alignment with the government's negotiating mandate. So our negotiators went into the room with a strong mandate, with a clear vision of what the Prime Minister and all the governments and industry associations wanted. I don't think we can say that here with Britain. Britain doesn't feel like industry is being consulted, and certainly Scotland and Northern Ireland don't feel that they have a stake in what's about to happen.
Shankar Singham, you heard that from the Canadian himself on the Canada deal.
Yeah, I think sometimes we can get a little bit overwhelmed with the use of the country name for a trade agreement.
Number 10 tweeted the very thing.
At the end of the day, a trade agreement are it's words on a page. The reason that David Frost in his speech on Monday said, you know, a deal like the Canada deal, like the Japan deal, like the Korea deal, what he's saying is, look, these are the 3 most recent deals the EU has done. So we're looking for a free trade agreement like the sorts of free trade agreements that the EU has done. Obviously, the UK agreement will be different from CETA. There's a whole range of differences in the trading relationship. And the starting point, as you said, the starting point is zero tariffs, zero quotas, and regulatory identicality on day one. So it's a very different kind of negotiation. So what I think the UK government is looking for is a normal trade agreement. Now, when it comes to the level playing field stuff that your previous guest talked about, you have to differentiate from level playing field in terms of subsidies, labour, environmental rules, and being under the EU's legal order. Those are 2 totally different things. And I think what Frost and what Boris Johnson said is, look, we're an independent sovereign country. We're going to have our own rules. That doesn't mean that we're not going to agree things in labour and environment and these other areas.
But it would essentially be quite a weak, unenforceable.
No, I don't think so. I think it's just a very different structure. So one structure, what the EU apparently seems to want, is that with state aids, the UK would be under the European state aids rules. Well, you know, the EU is looking at level playing field with China, with lots of other countries, and I think they're right to do that. But nowhere are they saying, well, you need to be under our rules. So,
but fundamentally, is it not up to them? If we held all the cards, to coin a phrase, they wouldn't be asking of us such stringent requirements.
Well, I think they are, and Lewis Goodall alluded to this in the earlier section. I think they are overplaying their hand. They are assuming that this government is going to be like the May administration, is going to sort of fall over the first sign of a breath of wind. But they're not going to.
What did you make of that social media message atting Michel Barnier? I mean, you're a negotiator. Would you deploy that? It seemed a little needy from where I was standing.
What I would say is, look, the most important thing here is, why does the European Union want these level playing field provisions? They don't want UK companies to be subsidised by the government when their companies can't be because of the state aid rules. But Frost also said very clearly, you know, we don't intend to be minimalist on competition policy. So we can have our own regime that prevents UK companies from being subsidised unduly. That would be part of our own legal order, and then you agree that with the other side. Labour and environment, by the way, that's not a problem, because we are already going to say that we're not going to lower labour and environmental standards for trade advantage.
But can we both agree that both sides in this deal are rowing back a bit from what was agreed in October, November?
Well, I mean, I think obviously we've had a huge circumstance that's changed here in Britain in that Boris Johnson has now won a majority with a strong, healthy majority, and he feels that he has a bit more license and leeway to change how he's going to approach the negotiations. But yes, on paper, we have downgraded the ambition already, and it might downgrade even further to get to the end of the year. I think we were looking at a narrower deal than people might have hoped in October 2019. But we shouldn't be surprised that both sides are puffing out their chests and trying to draw a few lines before they get in the room.
You mentioned the timing.
It's going to have to move. If they can get this over the line in any sort of kind of comprehensive deal, looking at not only the trading agreements, but other areas like defense, security cooperation, that would be hugely ambitious if Canada's experience is anything to go by.
Andrew mentioned this thing about how the Canadians got on board the business community. We've seen very little engagement. In fact, in some quarters, the business community is seen as the enemy, the people that backed the EU. Wouldn't it be better for the government to get the business community on board? Or are they just aligners that can't be rescued?
One of the things I would say is that if you look at the political declaration, there's more detail of what the future relationship will be in the political declaration than in any negotiating mandate I've ever seen. So the business community knows what the government's negotiating position is going to be.
And are you advising them to plan for checks, to plan for customs
The one thing we
frictions?
don't know, the one thing we can't control is what the EU response to UK proposals will be. And if the EU continues to say that unless you are dynamically aligned to our regulation, in other words, you're a rule taker with no say, or you are under the European state aid rules, then there's no way that this government can do a deal on that basis.
So do you think talks could collapse? Could talks collapse and we face tariffs, a mini trade war?
Well, I think that once the EU does realise that there is a new government, that there is an 80-seat majority, and that they aren't going to collapse in November, as I think they still think they might do, then I think the door is then open for a sensible discussion about what these level playing field obligations would be. And I think once we start having that sensible discussion, the parties are actually much closer together than people assume. We are at least now both aspiring to a free trade agreement, which was not the case for the last 3 years.
But I think the first 3 months of this negotiation period, from March until May, we'll separate a lot of wheat from the chaff and see where we stand by the time deals are supposed to be done, things like fish, and a decision has to be made whether you extend. I think we'll have a much clearer picture come June.
And we can work out what the tariffs on the wheat are at the same time. Thank you very much, Andrew MacDougall and Shankar Singham.